For over a century, Minnesota has harbored one of history's greatest secrets, a mystery buried beneath the soil and hidden in plain sight. But now, ancient DNA is revealing the truth about visitors who arrived on American shores centuries before we ever imagined they could. When you think of Vikings, your mind probably conjures images of fierce Scandinavian warriors sailing across icy northern seas, their dragon-headed ships cutting through waves as they raid the coasts of Europe. It's a narrative that has dominated our understanding of these remarkable seafarers for centuries, a story of brutal warriors, unstoppable explorers, and a people so distinctly Nordic that they seemed almost mythical in their purity and purpose. But what if everything we thought we knew about the Vikings was fundamentally incomplete? What if the true story of their exploration and expansion is far more complex, far more extensive, and far more genetically diverse than historians ever dared to suggest? For generations, the accepted boundaries of Viking exploration have been remarkably fixed. We know they reached Iceland. We know they established settlements in Greenland. We know that Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, managed to reach Newfoundland around the year 1000 AD, making contact with lands that would eventually become known as North America. And there, at a place called L'Anse aux Meadows, on the very northern tip of Newfoundland, the Vikings left behind evidence of their presence, the remains of turf-built structures, iron nails, tools, and artifacts that archaeologists uncovered in the 1960s. This site became the linchpin of our understanding, the concrete proof that Vikings had indeed crossed the Atlantic and touched the shores of the New World. But for many years, especially in Minnesota, there have been whispers of something more. There have been claims that the Vikings traveled far beyond Newfoundland. There have been stories of settlements deeper into the continent. There have been artifacts and runestones that suggested a more extensive presence than the academic world was willing to acknowledge. The most famous of these claims centers on the Kensington runestone, a mysterious stone artifact discovered in 1898 by a Swedish-American farmer named Olof Oman and his son while clearing land near the small town of Kensington. The inscription on this stone, if authentic, would suggest that Vikings led by someone named Paul Knutson ventured into Minnesota itself in 1362, centuries after Leif Erikson's initial explorations. The runestone weighs approximately 200 pounds and is covered with what appears to be runic inscriptions. According to the translation, the message reads something like a marker left by Nordic explorers who had ventured into the interior of North America. The very idea that such a document could exist fascinated scholars, yet simultaneously invited ridicule and skepticism from the academic establishment. For over 100 years, the scholarly establishment dismissed these claims almost entirely. The Kensington runestone was labeled a hoax. The artifacts were deemed fraudulent. The theories were relegated to the dustbin of pseudoscience and regional pride. Experts were nearly universal in their dismissal, treating Minnesota's Viking claims with barely concealed skepticism. This was partly justified. There were indeed many fraudulent claims, misidentified artifacts, and overzealous interpretations scattered throughout the historical record. But it was also partly a function of academic gatekeeping, a tendency to protect established narratives against inconvenient evidence. The dismissal was so complete that anyone who seriously advocated for Minnesota Viking theories risked damaging their academic reputation. This created a chilling effect on research, a disincentive for scholars to investigate claims that might challenge the established consensus. The result was a hardening of orthodoxy, a situation where the boundaries of Viking exploration became fixed not by evidence but by the weight of established opinion. This archaeological confirmation changed the conversation entirely. Suddenly, the idea that Vikings might have ventured further into the continent seemed less outlandish. If they could reach Newfoundland, why couldn't they have reached the Great Lakes region? If they could establish settlements on one part of the Atlantic coast, why not others? These techniques have allowed scientists to construct detailed maps of human migration, to identify genetic ancestry with unprecedented precision, and to reveal truths about ancient populations that no amount of documentary evidence or archaeological artifacts could ever fully illuminate. The power of genetic analysis lies in its objectivity and its ability to read the ancient record written in our very cells. In 2020, the largest genetic study of Vikings ever conducted was published in the prestigious journal Nature. This monumental research project, led by Professor Eske Willerslev from the University of Copenhagen and the University of Cambridge, involved analyzing DNA from 442 ancient individuals whose remains were recovered from more than 80 different Viking sites scattered. What the DNA revealed was that the Vikings were far more genetically diverse than anyone had previously imagined. The study demonstrated that Viking identity was not primarily determined by genetic ancestry. People of vastly different genetic backgrounds participated in Viking expeditions, established Viking settlements, and adopted Viking culture. The research showed that many individuals buried in Viking graves with Viking artifacts and Viking honors carried genetic markers indicating ancestry from southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and even as far as the Eurasian steppe. Some of the people we consider Vikings had genetic ancestry more closely related to ancient Anatolians than to the people of Scandinavia. Others carried genetic signatures indicating African ancestry. Still others showed complex mixtures of Sami, Celtic, and Scandinavian lineages. Perhaps most provocatively, the study revealed that being a Viking was not an ethnic designation at all. It was a social role. It was a job description, a way of life that people adopted, regardless of their genetic origins. You could become Viking through participation in Viking society, through adoption of Viking cultural practices, through intermarriage and integration. The Vikings were not a genetically pure warrior caste, descending from some mythical Scandinavian homeland. They were a complex, interconnected trading network of people from numerous ethnic backgrounds and geographic origins who had adopted a seafaring, trading, raiding, and exploring lifestyle. This genetic revolution has profound implications for how we understand Viking expansion. If Vikings were so genetically diverse, so willing to incorporate people from distant lands, so focused on trade and settlement rather than pure conquest and plunder, then we need to reconsider the entire scope of their explorations. We need to ask ourselves whether the boundaries we've accepted for Viking expansion, boundaries that conveniently end at Newfoundland, are really accurate, or whether they're simply the boundaries of the archaeological evidence we've chosen to look for. Consider what we know about Viking exploration patterns. We know they traveled to Iceland around 870 AD. We know they reached Greenland and established settlements there. We know they established settlements in the British Isles, throughout Scandinavia, along the coasts of Russia, and deep into Central Asia through river systems. We know they traded with Constantinople, with the Islamic world, with distant civilizations whose names and locations we're still discovering. We know they were perhaps the greatest seafarers of their age, capable of navigating across open ocean using techniques that modern researchers are still struggling to fully understand. Given all this knowledge about their maritime capabilities, their trading networks, and their willingness to establish settlements in hostile and remote territories, is it really so implausible that some Vikings ventured into the heart of North America? The Minnesota question has long been controversial precisely because the evidence has been so ambiguous. The Kensington runestone remains disputed, though some modern experts argue that certain aspects of its runes and language patterns are consistent with 14th century Norse writing. Linguistic analysis has suggested that some features of the inscription could not have been easily faked by a 19th century farmer, even one familiar with Scandinavian languages. But what if we approach this question not through archaeology, not through disputed artifacts, but through the revolutionary lens of ancient DNA? What if we could extract genetic material from remains found in Minnesota and determine with scientific precision whether those individuals carried Viking ancestry? This is precisely what recent research has begun to explore. In early 2026, reports emerged suggesting that ancient DNA recovered from skeletal remains discovered in Minnesota showed genetic markers consistent with North Atlantic Viking populations. The implications of such findings would be extraordinary. If confirmed and independently verified through rigorous scientific protocols, such discoveries could fundamentally rewrite our understanding of Viking expansion and prove that these Norse explorers ventured into the American interior centuries ago, leaving behind a genetic legacy that has persisted into the modern era. But let's step back and understand why this matters so much, beyond mere historical curiosity. The Vikings represent one of history's greatest mysteries about human exploration, adaptation, and cultural exchange. They were not the simple raiders and pillagers that popular culture has depicted them as. Modern scholarship has increasingly revealed them as sophisticated traders, skilled shipbuilders, political strategists, and cultural architects who shaped the medieval world in profound ways. They founded Dublin, they established trading posts that became major European cities, they influenced languages, legal systems, and genetic profiles across Europe and beyond. They created a trading network that stretched from North America to the Middle East. Understanding the true extent of Viking expansion helps us understand not just medieval history, but the deep roots of the modern world. It helps us understand how cultures mix and interact. It helps us recognize that historical narratives, no matter how firmly established they seem, are often incomplete and subject to revision in light of new evidence. And it serves as a humbling reminder that the textbooks we relied on in school, while valuable, represent only a snapshot of historical knowledge at a particular moment in time. The science of ancient DNA has revolutionized archaeology and anthropology in ways that few technologies have done. Before the genetic revolution, archaeologists had to rely primarily on material culture, the objects left behind by ancient peoples, to understand migration patterns, settlement histories, and cultural exchanges. But objects can be misinterpreted. Dating can be imprecise. Artifacts can be moved, traded, or stolen, making their original context unclear. DNA, by contrast, is far more precise. It carries within it a detailed record of ancestry, migration, and genetic interaction that can be read like a text written in a language older than any human civilization. Hey, use specialized polymerase chain reaction techniques. They cross-reference findings with databases of modern populations, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and they build statistical models to understand the likelihood of various migration and settlement scenarios. The error margins have shrunk dramatically. The confidence levels have increased substantially. Consider the specific case of genetic markers associated with North Atlantic Viking populations. These populations, which flourished between roughly 750 and 1050 AD, developed distinctive genetic signatures that differentiate them from other Scandinavian populations. They show evidence of genetic mixing with populations from the British Isles, from the Baltic region, and from distant lands. When geneticists sequence DNA from ancient remains, they can compare the genetic sequences they find to databases of known Viking populations and determine with remarkable precision whether an individual shares ancestry with North Atlantic Vikings. They can identify specific mutations and genetic combinations that are characteristic of particular populations. If remains recovered from Minnesota archaeological sites were to show such genetic markers, it would constitute powerful evidence that Vikings did indeed travel to the interior of North America. The geographic distance involved would be substantial. Newfoundland to Minnesota is roughly 1,200 miles as the crow flies, longer by water and through portage routes. But Vikings were capable of traveling vastly greater distances. We know they reached Central Asia through river systems. We know they established trading posts across vast territories spanning thousands of miles. For Vikings accustomed to traveling thousands of miles through open ocean and unknown rivers, the journey from Newfoundland to Minnesota would have been challenging, but absolutely not impossible. The methods Vikings would have used to reach Minnesota are also worth considering. The most likely route would have involved traveling southward along the North American coast from Newfoundland, potentially establishing a series of coastal settlements and trading posts. From these coastal bases, they could have ventured inland through river systems. The St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes system, and the major river valleys of the Midwest would have provided natural highways for Viking traders and explorers. This is precisely how other Viking trading networks operated, through a combination of coastal settlements and riverine penetration into continental interiors. Viking navigation techniques were remarkably sophisticated for their time. They used a combination of celestial navigation, knowledge of ocean currents and weather patterns, and techniques that may have involved navigational devices like sunstones that helped them navigate in cloudy conditions. They possessed detailed knowledge of coastlines and shipping routes that they accumulated through repeated voyages and shared through oral traditions and possibly through written documents that have not survived. They were expert builders of ships capable of handling both open ocean and shallow river navigation. Moreover, we know from historical and genetic evidence that Vikings were intensely motivated to explore and establish trade relationships with new territories. They were not content to remain in Scandinavia. They were not satisfied with the wealth available through trading with established European powers. They were driven by profit motives. A trading post in Minnesota would probably consist of only a handful of structures, used seasonally perhaps, and then abandoned or destroyed when the Vikings moved on. Such a settlement would be far less likely to survive archaeologically than the larger, more permanent settlements at L'Anse aux Meadows or other established sites. Second, any Viking artifacts left behind could easily be misidentified or overlooked by archaeologists unfamiliar with Viking material culture. A corroded iron tool could be mistaken for something of local origin. Coins or trade goods could be lost and subsequently discovered without clear understanding of their origins. The famous Kensington runestone itself is a perfect example of this problem. Genuine or not, it went unrecognized for years and has remained disputed, despite modern linguistic analysis suggesting it might be authentic. Third, environmental factors could have destroyed or buried evidence. Centuries of geological processes, agricultural activity, and urban development could have obscured or eliminated physical traces of Viking presence. This is especially true in the Midwest, where European settlement and development have been extensive. Any shallow Viking settlement could easily have been completely destroyed and forgotten. The movement of glacial soils and the action of freezing and thawing cycles over centuries could have scattered or buried artifacts beyond recognition. Finally, genetics provides a more durable record than artifacts in some cases. Even if all physical evidence of Viking presence in Minnesota were destroyed, the genetic legacy would persist. If Vikings intermarried with indigenous populations, or if later European settlers included individuals of mixed Viking indigenous ancestry, modern DNA analysis could detect these genetic signatures, generations or even centuries later. This is actually one of the most powerful aspects of genetic archaeology. It reveals truths that material culture alone cannot. The discovery of potential Viking DNA in Minnesota remains controversial and requires careful verification through multiple independent laboratories and research teams. This is how good science works. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that evidence must be independently confirmed by scientists with no stake in proving or disproving the claims. But the possibility that such evidence exists, and that it might fundamentally revise our understanding of Viking exploration, is genuinely exciting. It represents the frontier of historical knowledge, the place where old certainties meet new capabilities for investigation and discovery. We should also consider what such a discovery would mean for our understanding of cultural exchange in the medieval world. If Vikings did reach Minnesota, they would have encountered indigenous peoples who had developed sophisticated civilizations over thousands of years. These interactions, had they occurred, would represent an important chapter in pre-Columbian North American history. We would need to examine how Vikings interacted with indigenous populations, whether they traded, whether they fought, whether they established any kind of sustained relationships. This could reveal new aspects of both Viking culture and indigenous North American cultures. The genetic evidence could also tell us about the outcomes of such interactions. Did Vikings establish breeding populations with indigenous peoples? Did genetic admixture occur? Could some modern indigenous populations, or modern Minnesota residents of Scandinavian descent, carry genetic markers indicating mixed Viking Native American ancestry? These questions are scientifically tractable and potentially answerable through careful genetic analysis. They could rewrite not just the history of Vikings, but the history of North America itself. It's worth noting that this kind of historical revision has happened before. For generations, scholars dismissed stories of ancient Norse exploration in North America as mythology. The sagas that mentioned a land called Vineland and described voyages to the west were treated as folklore, colorful stories with no factual basis. Then L'Anse aux Meadows was discovered, and suddenly the sagas seemed far more credible. What had been mythology became history. The same process could occur with Minnesota. What is currently dismissed or disputed could become established fact in light of new genetic evidence. The broader implications of Viking expansion into Minnesota would be significant for multiple reasons. First, it would extend the known boundaries of Viking exploration further south and west than previously accepted. This would suggest a far more extensive Viking presence in North America than current academic orthodoxy acknowledges. It would place Vikings in direct contact with indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region, opening entirely new questions about cultural interaction and trade. Second, such a discovery would vindicate, at least partially, the long-standing claims made by Minnesota's Scandinavian communities and by proponents of the Kensington runestone and other Minnesota Viking theories. While not necessarily proving that every claim made by these communities was accurate, it would prove that some form of Viking presence in Minnesota was real. This would represent a significant validation of local historical traditions and oral histories that the academic establishment had dismissed. Third, it would demonstrate the power of genetic archaeology to overturn established narratives and reveal historical truths that archaeological and documentary evidence alone could not uncover. As we develop increasingly sophisticated tools for analyzing ancient DNA, we will likely discover many such historical revisions. The Vikings in Minnesota might be just the beginning of a broader reassessment of medieval exploration and cultural contact across the globe. The research currently being conducted by geneticists examining potential Viking DNA from Minnesota represents some of the most cutting-edge historical science available. Teams are working to extract DNA from skeletal remains recovered from various sites across Minnesota. They are comparing the genetic sequences they obtained to databases of known Viking populations and to genetic profiles of indigenous North American populations. They are running statistical analyses to determine the likelihood of various historical scenarios. And they are working with archaeologists and historians to contextualize their findings and understand what they might mean for our understanding of the past. The timeline of these discoveries is worth considering. Reports of ancient DNA suggesting Viking presence in Minnesota have been emerging in early 2026, suggesting that the research is ongoing and that revelations may continue to emerge in coming months and years. As more samples are analyzed, as more sites are investigated, and as the scientific techniques continue to improve, we may expect additional findings that either confirm or challenge the current claims. Of course, skepticism is warranted, and it's important not to overstate the significance of findings before they are fully published and peer-reviewed. Science proceeds through careful verification and independent confirmation. A single study, even a carefully conducted one, is not sufficient to overturn decades of established historical understanding. But when multiple research teams, using different methodologies, arrive at similar conclusions, when the evidence becomes overwhelming and consistent, then the historical record must be revised. The Vikings represent one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Their impact on the medieval world was profound and lasting. Their genetic legacy persists in modern European and potentially North American populations. Their innovations in shipbuilding, navigation, and trade influenced the course of world history. And their story, as it turns out, may be far more extensive and far more complex than we ever imagined. The ancient DNA now being extracted from Minnesota soil may finally provide definitive answers to questions that have fascinated historians for more than a century. In doing so, it may teach us that history itself is never finished. It is always subject to revision in light of new evidence, new technologies, and new questions. Perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. As we continue to develop more sophisticated tools for investigating the past, we should remain humble about what we think we know and open to discoveries that challenge our established understanding. The Vikings in Minnesota represent just one example of how science can illuminate hidden chapters of human history, revealing stories that have been buried beneath the soil and forgotten for centuries, waiting only for the right tools and the right moment to finally be told.